Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Site Performance Patterns. Your speakers for today are Andrew Taylor, Agency and Community Engineer here at Pantheon, along with our guest speaker, Narayan Newton, CTO at Tag One Consulting. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the presentation in the question window, or tweet them at @GetPantheon. We will answer as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone next week. I'd now like to turn it over to Andrew and Narayan.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Narayan. I'm the lead systems engineer and CTO at Tag One Consulting. I've in the past been the Drupal.org sysadmin for about 8 or 9 years. I was one of the authors of the O'Reilly Drupal performance book, and I'm the systems engineer for Tag One's Drupal 6 long-term support service. And today I'll be co-presenting with Andrew.
Yeah, my name's Andrew Taylor. As Atusa said, I'm Agency and Community Engineer at Pantheon. I come from more of a WordPress background, but have been diving into Drupal since my time at Pantheon. You can find me at ataylorme on GitHub and Twitter. And so we're going to dive right in and start talking about New Relic. And the first thing I want to show you guys is how to enable New Relic from your Pantheon site. So in order to do this, just log in, go into your site dashboard. So once you log in and click on a site, go all the way down on the left-hand side to New Relic and click Activate New Relic Pro. And that's all you need to do. Pantheon will go ahead and set that up for you. One thing to keep in mind that as we go through this webinar and we're showing things with New Relic is that New Relic does actually need traffic in order for it to gather data. So if you have a site that's in development or hasn't launched yet, then you'll probably want to run a load test or something similar to kind of simulate the traffic you would get when you actually go live. But we're going to talk a little bit about what New Relic is. New Relic is application performance monitoring, and this is more for back-end performance. We're going to look at things like PHP, MySQL, external web calls, and things like that. So what you're getting is New Relic APM, and this is really great for troubleshooting your site, but you can optimize your back-end performance like we're going to talk about here. But if you're loading in a ton of items with JavaScript after the back-end of the site is loaded, after page load, maybe you're pulling in some social media stuff or videos or things like that, it's not going to help you with performance on that side as much. So just kind of keep that in mind. One of the fundamental items that you need to be aware of when working with New Relic is Apdex score. And this is simply the time it takes for your site to load that is satisfactory. So what I generally like to do is New Relic has a default, and I like to adjust that. So if I'm working on a new project, I'm going to lower this score so that I'm getting alerted on site performance and go in and make some of these optimizations we're going to talk about today. And once you kind of find that baseline of where your site's going to be after you've done the optimizations and you're going to launch, then you can go in and kind of set the Apdex score along those lines. So if you make a new deployment in the future and your performance worsens, then you're going to be alerted to that. So again, I just want to stress that you shouldn't leave this at the default. You should configure it. New Relic kind of takes a guess of when your site should load. So if you have a kind of simple site, maybe your agency site doesn't have a lot going on, that might have a much lower Apdex score than something like an e-commerce site that has a lot of functionality and a lot going on. And when your site does drop below this Apdex score, this kind of threshold that you set, New Relic will send you email alerts. So again, if you leave it at the default and you're getting these alerts and you're kind of wondering, what are these emails I've been seeing? That's what it is. So go in, configure that Apdex score, and then take a look at these alerts. So you'll be notified of when your site starts performing under that threshold. So we can see here, it's showing me that my site performed poorly for about 20 minutes. And if I click on that details button, we're actually going to be brought into the New Relic dashboard, and we're going to get some more specific details around what was going on there. So we can see again that this was about an 18-minute period. Maybe there was a social media campaign, maybe an article went viral, whatever that was. If it's a one-time spike, then maybe you can plan for that better in the future. But if this is something that's happening constantly, then you're probably going to want to do a little more digging. And that leads us into transaction traces. This is where New Relic becomes super useful because you're not playing needle in the haystack anymore. New Relic will actually allow you to go in and open up slow transactions and kind of see which parts of your site are slow. So I can see in this example here that over 90% of my page load on this site is coming from this one function. And what's great about this is you can actually expand it out. So this action I can see was being called in the sidebar, and if I expand that farther, there's a Twitter widget that was fetching out to the Twitter API. And that's something we're going to look at more deeply here in a minute. But this is great because now I don't have to go, okay, which part of my site is being slow? I not only know that it's the sidebar, but I know exactly which widget in the sidebar and exactly what that widget is doing that's slow, so I can go in and troubleshoot that very specific area without spending a lot of my time trying to figure out what's going on. Another key concept with New Relic is that it allows you to set key transactions. So by default, there aren't any key transactions set up. These are something that you should go in and add for your site or your client sites. And these are things that are going to be business critical. So if we go back to that e-commerce site, checkout is something that is business critical. And if the homepage has a lot of products, we might expect that to load in a certain time, but we want the checkout to load a lot faster because we realize that if our checkout is slow, we're losing people and they aren't converting. So you can actually set up these key transactions, and New Relic will give you those same alerts when those specific portions of your site start to become slow. This can also be intensive items such as search. You can enable a key transaction for search so you can see what those SQL queries are looking like. Maybe there's ways for improvement there. And again, you can adjust the Apdex score on all of these key transactions. So if we wanted that shopping cart, in this case it's set to 0.85. So if our shopping cart loads slower than 0.85 seconds for 10 minutes, I'm going to get a caution, and then if it loads slower than 0.7 for 5 minutes, I'm actually going to get an alert and get an email about that. And you can customize these notifications as well. So perhaps the lead developer will want to be notified about all issues on the site, but maybe the business owner or somebody in a more business-oriented role will only be notified when the shopping cart is having issues. New Relic also has some integrations that are specific with Drupal and WordPress. We're looking at WordPress in this example, but if your site is running Drupal, then you will see that there instead of WordPress. And we can come in and kind of see that that sidebar in my site was what was being slow, and then we went and dove into that transaction trace and found out more details. Drupal also has an integration module that you can install that will mark cron and some other maintenance tasks as backend jobs in New Relic. So these are items that aren't there out of the box, but if you add this Drupal integration module, you'll just have a few more features there from Drupal showing up in New Relic. And the last thing I want to talk about when we're talking about getting started with New Relic is deployment markers. Pantheon has our Quicksilver platform hooks, and we actually have an example in our repository that is pretty much copy and paste. It pulls all the credentials you need from our environment variables and sets it so that when you do a deployment in Pantheon, you get a marker in New Relic. and we can see that line here in this example. I actually deployed PHP 7 on a site in a multi-dev environment, and we can see here that the PHP, the blue section of the graph, that load actually went down right after I deployed PHP 7, and that brought my total page load down as well. So this is really great. In this case, something went well, right? Our site's cruising along and getting faster as we do deployments, but and then you get an alert from New Relic and you start seeing that your site is slow. You can go back and see if that started right after you made a deployment, and maybe roll that back or kind of troubleshoot further to see what's going on with that code. The first example I want to talk about is external services. This is really great. New Relic can track external services, and it might be something that as you're building your application, you just drop in a widget for social media or something like that and don't really think about the impact it has on your site. This is an example here. This is an e-commerce example, so this page has the 25 most popular products in the store listed on the site, and we can see that there's some tweets in the sidebar there on the right-hand side. If we zoom in there, we're displaying the 5 most recent tweets. But we have an issue. If I come into New Relic, I got one of those alerts that the site was being slow, and I take a look at the overview graph, and I actually turned off PHP, MySQL, and other things. So I'm just viewing the web external, and we can see that in 1 minute, this was taking 118 milliseconds per request. So every time someone hit the site, those external calls were taking a bunch of time. And if I click on that and dive in further, I can see that 99% of that is coming from the Twitter API. And I've zoomed in a bit here. At the peak of that, in 1 minute, from 7:11 to 7:12, we had 452 calls to the Twitter API. So this tells me that in this particular case, those tweets are being loaded fresh on every single page load. Every time someone comes to the site, we have to go back to the Twitter API and refresh that data that we just served up to someone maybe even minutes or seconds ago. So the solution here, in this case, was to cache those. I used WordPress Transient API to cache those results. Since this is an e-commerce focused site, caching those results for 5 minutes is not a big deal. If you work with a site that is maybe a news site or something where that social media being in real time is business critical, then you might want to look at another solution. But for most cases, this is going to be fine. If a new tweet comes out and it doesn't show up on the site for 5 minutes, we're okay with that. And we can see our drop in page speed there. Pretty much as soon as I deployed that, those external API calls went down practically to 0. If we go in and look at our detailed graph in New Relic, we see that same time frame, a 1 minute period, we only had 5 calls, which is what I was expecting, 1 API call per tweet, and then we cache those, so that we don't have to go back to the Twitter API every time someone visits a site. The next example I want to look at is N+1 queries. You might be wondering what that means. Well, a query all by itself can be heavy even if it's unoptimized, but if you start adding in smaller tasks from inside a loop, those really add up. So maybe you're grabbing some metadata about a piece of content, maybe you're pulling in a thumbnail, and you do that one time and it's not a big deal. You do it for 10, 50, 100 items, and now that one extra call really is a big deal. So fetching template parts, metadata, images are all those small requests, but when you get them stacked together in a giant loop, it can kind of blow up in your face. So going back to our example with 25 products on the page, 25 is kind of a large number. One thing you might do is talk to your client and ask them, hey, can we decrease this to 10? Is someone really going to scroll all the way down to that 25th product and click it? But that only solves part of your issue. The other part, we kind of show this zoomed in here, is that we're pulling categories and tags for every single product on the page. And that might seem okay that, hey, we want to pull in all of this data, but when someone's looking at this kind of archival view, it makes sense to show them which category the product is in, but we can save the tags and some of that other data for the product detail page. So when they actually click through the product and they're viewing the details of that product, then they can see the tags at that point. They're not really necessary here. And if I go in and look at New Relic, it's going to tell me that this is causing an issue. I have 34 calls to get term, which is fetching that data on the page, and lots of template parts that are loading because of that. I went in and I removed tags from the template that reduce the query size, lessens the database calls, and we had on average 5 tags per product, and multiplied by 25 products, that really adds up. So we can see that just by making that change, and we deployed that out, we have our nice deployment marker there again, that our page load time went down, and we're really not showing something that the user might not be interested in on that page. And this is something that you'll want to look into your analytics and your own data and make sure that is a wise choice, but this is just a great example of how New Relic can alert us to where optimizations can be made. And now I'm going to turn it over to Narayan to talk about a views caching example.
Yes. So my example is somewhat similar to the N+1 queries example, in that what we're going to look at today is not the case of one thing performing egregiously out of bounds, but just one section of the site that is doing too much on a per page load basis. So for my example, I created a Commerce Kickstart demo site. You can do this yourself on Pantheon. Commerce Kickstart is very easy to spin up there, and this is literally just the demo site that is one of the options when setting up a Kickstart site. I did this because it's a nice demo site, it populates things nicely, and when I think of sites with performance problems, honestly, e-commerce kind of springs to mind. It seems like it does for Andrew as well. I also wrote a locust load test to throw some load against this site, in particular the products page, because the products page is important to this site and most e-commerce sites, and is a view that was showing some fairly complicated entities. So we can see that the products page is indeed causing us some problems. Going from here, we look at a transaction trace of this products page. And as Andrew was talking about before, when you're looking at these transaction traces, you can see that at the top, we have the overall page handler, which in our case is views page. And it has 100% of the duration, and you kind of go there and work your way down the transaction, looking for where your time is being. In our case, we have 1.8 seconds at the top. We're working our way down. We get to about 1.12 in view render. And then we can go down and we see that we're starting to split up quite quickly here. We have some time in view execute. We have most of our time fanning out in node view multiple to render each of these views, each of these nodes. And this is a semi-common problem with modern views. It used to be the case that you would come in to a view that was having a problem, and almost 100% of the time it was building a SQL query that was performing poorly. Views is still very capable of that, but a lot of the times in modern sites, and especially modern distributions on Drupal, what you're going to see is not necessarily that the view query is performing poorly, but that the render of the view is just doing too much. The entities and nodes that it's pulling onto the page are rich and are taking too much time in each case, even though, as you can see, each of these node views are taking like 76 milliseconds, 22 milliseconds. They're not huge amounts of time, but they add up quickly, which is why it's similar to the N+1 queries case. So we have a few options in how to fix this. This is a execution path that is delivering content directly to the client. So what we could do is either cache the page, put this into a varnish cache, or we could try to speed up each individual node view. That's certainly possible. We could look at render caching or entity caching to try to make the actual building of this view fast. However, in our case, it makes a lot more sense to just try to cache this view. However, we're an e-commerce site, or we are in this demo. So I don't want to update information about a product, in particular the price or the description, and have a TTL run out before that product's information is correctly displayed. So we're going to use the Views Content Cache, which is a caching plugin you can install for Views that instead of caching view content and a view query for a specific amount of time, a specific TTL, it selectively clears the Views cache when a certain content type is updated. So it hooks into Node API, and you can select which content types, in our case, any of our product types, that cause a Views cache clear. I reran my load test. You can see we have an immediate spike as the cache was empty, and then it settles down, the cache is filled, and we end up satisfying our Apdex score. It should be noted we are satisfying our Apdex score with not a huge load test, but quite a few users, and with page caching and varnish caching entirely turned off. So this is just that one view being cached that had that much impact on the page. Our next demo is somewhat similar, but it's kind of coming at this from a different angle, and also is showing one of my favorite uses for New Relic, and specifically New Relic on Pantheon. They have the Quicksilver project that Andrew talked about earlier that allows you to mark deployments and easily monitor deployments. New Relic is useful for a number of things, but really being able to monitor the impact of new code pushes is one of my favorite ways for using New Relic, and is the one that I've seen had the most impact for organizations. This is the same site, the same Commerce Kickstart demo, and what happened here is I pushed a deployment that really destroyed performance. With the Views cache enabled, I had things below 500 milliseconds, even without page caching turned on, and then I pushed a very small deploy, and our performance is completely gone all the way up to 1500 milliseconds. Catching this in the first 5 or 10 minutes of a deploy and being able to roll it back is incredibly useful, and can turn a small problem that you have a little meeting about into an incident if it goes for 24 hours, or worst, if a user reports it before you find it. So we're going to start looking at transactions at this point to try to figure out what happened with this deploy. The first thing I do when looking for a problem like this is basically pull up any transaction traces I have and open them into multiple tabs and try to get a trend. So the reason I do that is you look at this transaction, we're spending most of our time in Drupal find theme functions. We see a theme process registry call. We see a theme build registry. This is clearly spending most of its time rebuilding the theme registry. However, if you just look at this and take this one transaction and run with that, it's possible you're being led astray. This could be a red herring. You could have picked the one transaction that is actually reloading the theme registry. In particular, if you are monitoring New Relic around deploys, you just deployed code. It's possible that you also cleared all your caches, and that these are not representative of the actual problem. So you go into the second transaction, the third, the fourth, and you find out that this is actually a problem. We do appear to be building the theme registry on every transaction, and that is what has destroyed our performance. So now we can look at the details. Again, we see that we have the overall page handler, node page view. We can go down and see that in the special menu items init, we're going into breadcrumb management, we're going into theme get registry, theme load registry, and now we're starting to build the theme registry. The reason I wanted to talk about this particular example is that many times we come into a situation where we have this clear problem in the New Relic trace, but maybe what you're seeing and the time that's being spent is more the result of the problem than the actual problem. So this is rebuilding the theme registry on every single transaction. Can we really speed that process up? I mean, to some extent, probably. You could spend a lot of time trying to make the actual theme registry build faster, maybe try to reduce what the theme registry is doing, reduce the number of themes you have, most likely. Upgrade to PHP 7, try to throw more resources at it. You can do all these sorts of things. But the real problem in this case is that the theme registry is rebuilding on every transaction at all. And so a lot of times when we go in and we find these slow traces and we find a very clear execution path that is too slow, I like to consider whether that execution path is ending in loading an internal cache or an internal registry, or whether that execution path is returning content to the client. In our first example, it was most definitely returning content to the client. That was a view, it was showing products, it was going directly to the client browser. However, in this case, we're loading an internal registry that's not going to the client. The problem is not really how long this takes to load, but that it is running, and we need to look at what this system is doing, the theme registry, and figure out what clears it. In this case, what clears it is Drupal theme rebuild. And if we look through our transaction list, basically go to the documentation, find out what the theme registry is loading, find out how that thing gets cleared, and then look for that function, we actually do find it in our transaction list. It's in the PHP template init, and we're rebuilding the theme registry. And what actually happened here is that the Drupal theme rebuild call got put into the template.php for the theme. This happens more than you might think. It's a fairly common way to debug themes. Some themes, in particular, Zen used to have this, actually have a toggle that allow you to turn this on and off for development, and it was specifically added to try to keep this from being pushed live. Sometimes this is still pushed live. So the entire point of this, really, is that New Relic is a very, very powerful tool, and using these transaction traces allow you to find problems easily. But too many times I see people spending inordinate amount of time on a path of execution that is slow, but is internal, and the actual issue here took 6 seconds to run. So it is important still to look at what the transaction trace and the subsection of the transaction trace you're looking at is actually doing. If it's housekeeping, something internal, if it's going to the client. If it's going to the client, maybe try to make it housekeeping, try to put views cache in front and make it an internal thing more than an external thing. And most importantly, to use New Relic to monitor deployments. The combination of New Relic on Pantheon and Quicksilver to mark your deployments and possibly even kick off a load test to put some load on the test environment before you go live to be able to find these problems before they even become user problems is a huge advantage. And now Andrew is going to talk a little bit about network level optimizations you can make.
Hey, Andrew, looks like you may still be on mute.
Sorry about that.
You are back in line.
So we've been talking a lot about New Relic and performance on the back end, but that can only take you so far, and there's some things that you can't do on the back end or even on the front end of your site. So we're going to talk about things on the network level. In this case, implementing a CDN is a great way to serve static assets, images, CSS files, JavaScript from an edge location that is closer to your user. For example, Pantheon is in the States, but if you have a user that's maybe in Europe and they come and visit your site, and we go back to that e-commerce example where we have 25 products on a page, all of those thumbnails and those things can be served from a server a lot closer to them than from where we are. And this kind of goes back to data can only move so fast. We can't increase the speed of light and get things there any quicker, but if our starting point of where we're sending the data from is a lot closer, then we're going to cut that time down. And the other thing that you get with the CDN in a lot of cases is the ability to add HTTPS and HTTP2. So the HTTP1 protocol has been around for a long, long time, and HTTP2 is really awesome because it has this idea called multiplexing. So normally when the browser requests something from the server, if there's those 25 thumbnails on the page, the browser has to go, hey server, give me a thumbnail. Hey server, give me another thumbnail. Now the browser can go, hey server, I need 25 thumbnails, and the server can pass them over together at the same time, and that's multiplexing. So we can see here a test that was run that served 200 images, once on HTTP1 and once on HTTP2, and we can see the results that it was a little over 3 times faster just because we're piping all those images over at the same time rather than doing it one at a time. In order to enable HTTP2, you need your site to be secure. You need to have HTTPS. That's a requirement. So you can use services. A lot of CDNs, like we mentioned, have this available to you. So if you look at like Cloudflare, Fastly, or whatever CDN service you want to use, they often have SSL available. And with services like Let's Encrypt providing free certificates, there's really no reason not to do it. And that's all we have for the webinar portion and going through these examples, but we're going to open it up to some Q&A.
All right, we're going to start with an easy one, and that is this demo on the features with a New Relic or with a New Relic Pro?
So that's great. We are looking at New Relic APM Pro. Previously, Pantheon came with a 2-week trial of these features, but now with every site you have on Pantheon, you actually get access to the Pro version. So it's no longer a 2-week trial. Pro is opened up for everyone on the Pantheon platform.
All right, next question is, where in New Relic is the transaction trace page?
There is no specific page for transaction traces. This kind of goes back to Apdex score, and you might not even have any transaction traces showing up unless your site is below the Apdex threshold. So go in, make that adjustment. Like I said at the beginning, if I'm going to work on optimizations for a site, I like to lower Apdex, and I know my site is not going to meet that score, and I'm going to get a ton of alerts, but that will trigger those traces so you can go in and view them and start optimizing from there.
All right, this one, Andrew, this question came during your beginning portion of the presentation, so you might have to relate it to the content, but the question is, does the email alert go to the site owner or to me, the developer?
That's a good question. The email alert will go out to whoever activates New Relic on Pantheon. So we have that Activate New Relic Pro button on the site. So depending on who you want the email to go to initially, that's kind of the default. But then we showed you can configure those notifications. So that's the default person, is whoever activates it. But you can go back in and configure those notifications and change the email or add and remove people. They also have a text messaging option. So if you're running that transaction trace on the shopping cart and your shopping cart's down and you really want to be alerted, you could get that text message at 3 a.m.
Right. Next question is, are there any specific things we should look out for when using New Relic with WordPress?
There's nothing really specific to using WordPress and New Relic besides those integrations we showed previously, where New Relic has a section that will show you kind of the slow hooks and pieces of your WordPress site that are slow, but a lot of the content we covered, transaction traces and things like that, are going to work for WordPress and Drupal alike.
Does the external services graph detail work with non-Pantheon hosted Solr service providers?
So the external services is more talking about API calls. So in our example, we called out to Twitter. So if you were calling out to some other APIs within your site, then those would be listed. When you spin up Solar and Redis on Pantheon, those are shown. But in order to get an external Solar, maybe one you're self-hosting, or if someone opts to use Elasticsearch or something like that, you would actually need to enable that integration yourself. So you'd need to send the data from your Solar server over to New Relic.
Right. Can I create consolidated reports based on triggered problem events?
So I'm unclear exactly what you would mean by a consolidated report. When you get an event that happens, an error in New Relic, when you click on that, as one of Andrew's slides showed, it will show you the incident time. So in general, when you're not satisfying your Apdex in New Relic, that period where you're not satisfying the goal you set is highlighted in red in the overall graph. And then in the graph for the actual incident, you see what exactly happened in that incident time. If you're asking for an overall report of how often you didn't satisfy your Apdex and then being able to click into details on that, I'm not sure it really provides that, but you could probably put that together by going through the graphs.
I also want to mention that New Relic has an API as well, so if you wanted to fetch that data and create some sort of very customized report, you could do that. Another thing to keep in mind is setting up those key transactions. So whenever your site is not meeting that Apdex threshold, what you do by setting a key transaction is making sure that New Relic is going to trace those. So even if that's not what triggered or what is kind of the root cause of why your site is being slow in that specific period, those will still run. So you actually have those transaction traces for the other parts of your site that you really care about.
And just note, he did follow up saying something like a PDF report you might want to see in Google Analytics.
Yeah. Being able to export reports, not so much by default, but as Andrew noted, you can use the API.
Next question is, my organization already uses New Relic for several other applications. How do I bring my Pantheon site's New Relic into the same subscription?
If you wish to use an existing subscription that you have, then that's actually something that you will have to contact New Relic about. By default, when you enable New Relic on a Pantheon site, the license is associated with Pantheon in that site and not your existing license. So that's something that you'll have to get in touch with them about, and it's kind of a manual transition for them to reassign that site so it's associated with your license instead of the one that we're generating.
And this one was an earlier question, but it's in the same boat, and that is, did you discuss the New Relic cost/license info yet? So Andrew, if you could just give a brief on that.
Yep. So New Relic APM Pro is included, but New Relic does have other features, like they have some items that will dive into more of front-end performance and things like that that are not included. So everything we went over today is included, but if you want to check out other offerings by New Relic that are outside of the application performance monitoring, then that's something that, again, you'll have to get in touch with New Relic about and acquire an additional license for.
Going back to the reports question, because I apparently can't leave that alone, there's an SLA, a daily, weekly, and monthly SLA report that you can export to CSV, which is not exactly what you're asking for, but that may give you the information you would need to build a more rich report.
Good to know. I think this next question may take a demo on either Andrew's and or Narayan's. The question is, could you show how to go from an Apdex alert to the transaction trace page shown in your examples? I'm still not able to figure out how to get that view. Did you? Yep, I'm going to switch it over to Narayan's screen. Let's do a quick demo there.
Okay. So how you get to the transaction traces, you can do it a few ways. as you can see, this is my demo site, and I don't have a lot of traffic recently, but I do have these listed transactions right here. This is just the overview page, so if you go to New Relic, hit overview. One thing that sometimes confuses people is that there's a time picker right here. So if you're looking for traffic in a specific period, you'll often have to use this time picker to go back and forth. You can also do custom dates here. I've definitely seen that trip people up if they're looking for a load test that they ran a while ago. If you're in this overview page, you can go here to this transaction list, and then in user page right here, you can see there's actually a transaction trace that you can click right there. That will load this page, and then if you give it a second, it'll throw up this, which is what we were looking at before, and then you go into trace details, and this is what we were looking at. So you can collapse all of that right here. Here's the page handler, and then you can go through like this, or you can expand everything and just see the entire trace. You can also, from this page, see database queries that it caught and whether it thought those might be problematic. One thing you should be aware of, because sometimes it's hard to use that, is if you go to just the transaction list, you'll see the transactions it thinks are interesting, usually sorted by the overall page handler. You have transaction traces here. If you go to the Show All Transactions table, sometimes this is the easiest way to find transaction traces if you're looking for a trace that it doesn't think is particularly important. And then from here, how you do that is you click on the overall page handler of what you're interested in, and then you get this summary, and then you can go down here, and here are your transaction traces again. You click on one, and then you can get to trace details.
Thank you for that, Narayan. And just as a reminder to everyone, this will be recorded and sent to you, so if you guys want to walk through any of the examples or the demo, you'll have this available to you. Next question is, how do I know what my Apdex score should be?
So this is something we touched on a little bit at the beginning. And really what I would suggest is spinning up a new multi-dev or using your test environment. Narayan had said that in his test he actually turned off varnish full page caching. So that's a really good idea to kind of get a benchmark of where things are when someone actually does a hit through to the server and isn't getting a cache view. So turn off caching just for this test, never in production. Go in, run a load test with traffic that is similar to your live site. So you might pull that from Google Analytics or wherever you're getting that data. Run that test and just kind of see what happens. See what those average response times are. In the trace that Narayan has showing on the screen right now, the average response time was 1.4 seconds. So maybe you want to set your threshold at a little bit below that or above that. So if I wanted to do some optimizations, I could set it at like 1.2, and that's my goal. And then I'm going to go in and work on some of these optimizations, see if I can get the site down to that level. If you're not going to do any optimizations, then in this case it loaded in 1.4. You could maybe set that threshold at like 1.5. If 1.4 is kind of the average, then when it creeps up above that average into 1.5 and more is when you want the alarms to sound. And it's really more of your preference, but running a load test and kind of seeing where things stand currently is a good way to gauge where you're at and what you should set it from the default.
Right, next question is, what else other than SSL do you need from a custom server to run WordPress or Drupal over HTTP2?
Your server needs to support HTTP2, so depending on what you're running, that will vary. I would definitely, contact your host about that. And SSL is kind of the only hard requirement besides having a server that can actually handle HTTP2 and serve things and like send multiplexing out to the client. HTTPS is the only requirement on the network level.
All right, next question is, how does testing on the dev environment compare to that of test or live? In the past, I've been told that dev is less performant than either test or live.
Yeah, that's a great question. The dev server, our varnish full page caching on Pantheon, is actually turned down. And the reason for that is that if you deploy a change to your development server, you're working on things, you want to be able to see what that looks like right away. So we have that caching turned down. So that's why maybe the performance seems slower than test or live. Test and live both have that enabled, but again, maybe running some of these tests without as much caching to get that initial Apdex value, it's a good thing. So you could either do that in dev or a multi-dev environment.
Right. Next question is, why would you want to mark maintenance tasks as back-end jobs in New Relic?
The reason you'd want to do that is because New Relic has a concept of a back-end and a front-end job. Back-end jobs have a tendency to be longer running on purpose, whether you're sending out email, whether you're managing a queue, whether you're regenerating images, things that just are planned on taking a long time and are not directly impacting clients, so you likely care less that they're taking a long time. So if you have that just mixed in with your front-end traffic in New Relic, your New Relic numbers and whether you satisfy or don't satisfy your Apdex means less, because you're mixing in these transactions that are long running, but it doesn't really apply that they're long running. So what New Relic allows you to do is to mark those as background tasks, and you can still track them. If you go into New Relic, you can select, you can switch between front end and back end, and it shows a similar screen. It just shows your back end transactions. So you can see whether your cron is running longer than it should, or whether it errored, or something like that. But it doesn't pollute your front-end scores.
Alrighty, guys. Looks like those are all the questions we have for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any additional questions, you can join us at our agency office hours. We host those every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, Thursday at 2 p.m. Pacific Time. You'll get any of our experts on the line to answer your questions, so feel free to check our website for that. Or you can always use our Contact Us page, and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. Thank you all, and have a great week.